Hi, and welcome to the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Premium thought at a wholesale price. Asking the big questions. What does the text say? I'm your host, Calvinist Klein, a.k.a. clay in the master's hands, a.k.a. Romans 9:18. And today we're going to take a look at the sources of normativity and the paradox of self-legislation, principally examining the thought of Immanuel Kant. For the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. It is the mark of a great philosopher that he or she is referred to often, and that his or her work provides seminal insights for students of a later time. In that respect, Immanuel Kant must command a level of reverence reserved for few other human thinkers. For his work is rich, defining, and immeasurably helpful in discussing foundational issues in philosophy, and even, to a degree, in theology. When thinking about the modern era, a familiarity with his work is a must. Perhaps because of Kant's foundational place in enlightenment thinking, he is often seen as hostile to religion and the transcendental criticism that he inaugurated. Think of it as a synthesis between rationalism and empiricism, that is, an empirical rationalism or a rational empiricism, is generally considered the cornerstone of critical thinking or free thought in the modern and postmodern secular world. Think of the narratives of dogmatic gullibility and the misplaced faith in the common sense of the average man on the street, contrasted with the enlightened perspective of the secular, academic, educated brights, bringing the light of their secular worldview to a world darkened by outdated religious legend and myth. This was largely due to a secular convention of interpretation that presupposed the meaninglessness and unthinkability of the supernatural. Theology and religion could be dismissed out of hand without the need for considering the content of its doctrines and precepts. For the secular brights were fond of saying, it was so roundly and obviously defeated previously that it would be a waste of time to do so yet again. And yet, for all of this secular ethos, Kant himself was a powerful defender of religious belief in his works. Even as the philosophical system that he pioneered was used by secular philosophers to ground their atheistic rejection of religion in general, and Orthodox Christianity in particular. How can this be? How can the roots of modern secular humanism be indebted to a thinker that sought to not only put science on a more firm metaphysical foundation, but who thought he was doing the same for faith and religion as well? Kant defended, in some form, topics in biblical hermeneutics, doctrines such as original sin, the incarnation, vicarious atonement, the radical evil of sin, the change of heart in the Christian's new birth, the reality and properties of divine grace in an Augustinian sense, and the Holy Trinity. How is it that a system of philosophical thought meant to establish both faith and scientific reason could be characterized by secular followers as only establishing the phenomenal aspects of science? And what about the noumenal parts of reality? What about the things in themselves? How could they be so easily dismissed from a secular ontology? Perhaps it was Kant's work in the autonomy of self that set the stage for the secular revolution that was to follow. Where do moral obligations and truths come from? In the pre-Kantian world, such concepts were understood as being legislated externally from the human agent, endowed with a divine authority, or at least from a law of nature that imposed external requirements. The human creature was merely a passive recipient, a citizen of laws, not of his own making. But in the aftermath of Kant's self-legislation and the idea that it was the perceiving and thinking human being that created its own meaning and reality, thinkers in the 19th century kept emptying traditional moral categories of their authority and value, and replacing their external and objective quality with a relative quality generated by the self. The contrast between serve God with your whole heart and to thine own self be true could not be greater. This development was quite different from the Kantian aims, and the subtlety and nuance of Kant's theistic transcendental philosophy were lost in successive generations of philosophers who wanted nothing more than to realize the French Revolution's goal of no gods, no masters. Kant recognized duty as the supreme moral principle. Kant thought that the will was a kind of causality belonging to living beings insofar as they are rational. His categorical imperative established that the human being was constructed by God so as to have both an external authority and ground, as well as an internal self-legislated authority. The freedom of the will provided the basis for a relative theistic autonomy that was still objectively subservient to a God who legislated values of right and wrong. Indeed, the idea that a person's God-given inclinations were not to be considered a license to do whatever one would want, but rather one's inclinations were only valid through ratification by an independent, divine, rational authority. When human government gave laws to a nation, it was a picture of the relationship on a more visible level. In this view, the human creature gives itself its own laws in concert with divine law, and inclinations the human will might have outside of these boundaries would be illegitimate. As Kant said, if moral requirements are categorical or universally and necessarily valid, their authority cannot be based on appeals to empirical or contingent interests, such as the agent's inclinations. So consider a six-sided die as a model for the volition of an acting agent. It can, by nature, express a role in one of six states. So it might be thought free in that it might express any one of those six states for a given role. But it is not arbitrarily free in that it could not express itself outside of those states. That is, it could not roll a 7. The deterministic nature of this example might be thought somewhat ironic, but the idea of constrained choice is thereby illustrated. As Bernard Regenster summarized, Kant's idea of self-autonomy is that To be a rational agent is to deliberate about what to do. To deliberate about what to do, I must regard my will as free. To regard my will as free is to regard it, in particular, as not determined by the inclinations I happen to have. The point of view from which I deliberate is therefore independent of these inclinations. Any deliberation requires normative standards by the light of which it is conducted, and by which I determine which inclinations to pursue. The standards available from the deliberative point of view must therefore themselves be independent of those contingent inclinations. They must be, in other words, unconditional or objective standards. That is, pure reasons, binding on all rational agents, insofar as they are rational. In this schema, the human will is genuinely free in that it is not under external compulsion or necessity when exercised. Yet this freedom is not absolute, both naturally and morally. The will is constrained by the nature of the human subject, which cannot make choices outside of its own creaturely constraints and limitations. For example, one cannot will themselves to be 70 feet tall, or to grow a third arm, or to indefinitely abstain from eating food, etc. Further, it is constrained by the moral nature associated with being human and under the divine creation and law. That is, one cannot act arbitrarily against the divinely legislated duty for which God has called people to live by. This framework set the stage for much development in 19th century philosophy. In the work of philosophers like Fichte, Schiller, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and others. It is a fascinating progression to see where this original Kantian model would develop. For the Philosopher's Clearinghouse, I'm Romans 918.